So again, welcome to the community conversation on divestment and defund campaigns in Tulsa. This is the second community conversation we've had in this series hosted by Against Carceral Feminism, Oklahoma. The first one was on Saturday with folks who have done some incredible work in Norman. That video will be available soon if you are interested. And the next one is this coming Wednesday with folks from Oklahoma City. And I will post the link to that. If you are interested in attending, you can register at that link. So we have a really incredible panel tonight. Just to say a little bit about myself before we jump in with the panelists. My name is Vic Wiener. I use they, them pronouns. And as I said, I am on the steering committee for Against Carceral Feminism, Oklahoma. I have over 10 years of experience working in domestic violence and sexual violence, as well as youth work. And I currently work at the intersection of that, which is what brings me to my work with Against Carceral Feminism. And I am a committed abolitionist because of the work that I have done in those communities. As I said, this event is being put on by Against Carceral Feminism, Oklahoma, just so that we're all on the same page going into this and we know what just kind of very basics of carceral feminism is. Carceral feminism it locates the solution to sexual harm and to intimate partner violence and other forms of interpersonal violence within the carceral state. And so it looks to increase policing, incarceration, surveillance, and punishment as the solution to harm. And we are working against that. We're working against that framework, and we're trying to locate the responses to harm in communities and in support and care, and not into disappearing our community members. So that's what we do, and that is hopefully kind of some of the conversation that we're going to get to have tonight. So with that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just briefly introduce yourselves, introduce the type of work that you've done in this space, and then if there's anything else important you want to say about yourself and who you are and what you do, please do so. And I will start. I'm just going to go from the top of my screen, so I will start with Greg.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me tonight. Super excited to be a part of this conversation, and I love panels where I am the dumbest contributor, so this night would qualify as well. You probably know me most as a former mayoral candidate, but my work really has been around organizing and advocacy. I came back home to Tulsa in 2016 following the murder of Terrence Crutcher and began working to organize a community around common sense police reform. And so that's really been my entry into this conversation. I'm also a Black man, and we're sitting in a state that somehow incarcerates almost more Black men than anywhere else in the world per capita. And so this conversation is personal to me, particularly because when you think about what we do to Black women, it's worse. So glad to be here tonight and to dig in.
Thank you. I'm glad you're here. And next I'll go to Mana.
Good evening, everybody. Great seeing some of your faces and or avatars tonight. My name is Mana Tahaie. I use she, her pronouns. I am a first-generation American born right here in Oklahoma to Muslim asylee parents in the middle of a continuing very hostile relationship between my country of origin and the United States. I have been in Tulsa my whole adult life, which as of last month was 20 years. And I've been organizing against anti-immigrant policies at the municipal, county, state, and federal level since at least 2008, and started out as a police reform advocate right around 2012. And really believed in police reform for many years and have more recently moved firmly into the abolitionist camp. So I'm excited to talk about all of those experiences in the context of opposing carceral feminism tonight.
Thank you. And last but not least, Molly.
Good evening. My name is Molly Bryant. I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm a very proud member of the Cherokee Nation. My family has been here on this land since the removal, since the Trail of Tears. So I'm really committed to our community and really rooted here. I'm a licensed social worker by trade, and pretty much everything I know about carceral feminism and about organizing comes from the people that I've been lucky to work with and like struggle alongside. So my work in divestment campaigns really came about like through my work in the Tulsa County Jail. So I worked with women on immigration holds I worked with women on immigration holds who had varying backgrounds. But my perspective really comes from that immigrant justice lens, focusing on immigration enforcement as a way of controlling by the state. So my work has been primarily through that, focusing on ending one of our anti-immigrant policies in Tulsa County, but that's not where the work ends. So, yeah.
Thank you. So just so that we kind of can get a sense of the history and the work that has been done in Tulsa, can you all talk about the growth in demands around police accountability in Tulsa from a few years ago, kind of up to the summer of 2020? And then kind of since that have leaned more into the divestment conversation. So what led to this? What's the history?
A fun game of chicken. We're all kind of like a standoff.
I was going to suggest that Mana start.
As your elder, I shall start. Yeah, I started writing notes on this today, y'all, and I got hella depressed. The touchstones, just the ones that I could think of off the top of my head. I started thinking about it in terms of back in 2011 actually was kind of like, well, I should say this is specifically in terms of law enforcement. This is not having to do with like all of the global movements against the carceral state here in Tulsa. But back in 2011, when our local mosque hosted a law enforcement appreciation day, and then Captain Paul Fields refused to go, said that it was against his Christian beliefs, and started a national firestorm in support of his religious freedoms because he got, put on paid leave for 2 weeks for not going to a mandatory outreach event, which at the time was common in law enforcement. Incidentally, that gentleman is now a major over our special investigations division. A few years later, Jeremy Lake, a young man, was killed by an off-duty Tulsa Police Department cop back in 2014. I remember being at the site of one of the vigils that his family held and speaking to a reporter, and he demanded to know what kind of not white I was because I had concerns about this case. And it was really a moment of, wow, you really can only have compassion for people who are gunned down by law enforcement if you're not white. Okay. A few years after that, when the Black Lives Matter movement had really taken off, Commander Travis Yates posted on his own website, which is a national website, that the police were at war with Black Lives Matter and that they were facing the same discrimination that Black people faced under Jim Crow. He is currently a major over the Information Services Division at TPD. In 2015, Eric Harris was shot down by a pay-to-play Tulsa deputy, someone who had donated enough money to the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office to be able to go out on missions with them, and shot and killed Eric Harris on then Sheriff Stanley Glanz's watch, kind of igniting a campaign to recall the sheriff, who later retired as the longest running sheriff in Tulsa County, only to be succeeded by now Sheriff Vic Wiener, who campaigned as sort of the the first quote unquote Hispanic candidate, but very vehemently supported 287G and a host of other anti-immigrant agreements that the sheriff's department and the jail have with federal immigration enforcement. 2016 was a big year. There's a lot that went down that year. I think it was 2016, maybe 2015, that Khalid Jabara was murdered after Tulsa Police Department failed to protect him after he asked for protection against his neighbor who had assaulted him and his family many times. Law enforcement simply said that if he wasn't on site with a gun, there was nothing they could do, and so they left the scene and he was killed within minutes of them leaving. And then, of course, our own Terrence Crutcher, whose anniversary just passed this last week, was killed 5 years ago by a Tulsa police officer named Betty Shelby. I think I want to end on that one specifically because the narrative arc of carceral feminism is rooted in the idea that white women's purity needs to be protected by the state, and that the fear of assault and of attack on the purity of white women has been used time and time again to enact violence against communities of color, especially Black communities. And there is an eerie parallel between what happened in 1921 here in Tulsa, where the purity of a white woman's virtue was used to massacre an entire community, and the fear of a white woman was used to justify the murder of an unarmed Black man who was having an emergency. And I think all of these instances reinforce the idea that law enforcement is not here to protect us. They're actually here to occupy and surveil and control us in order to protect the wealth and property and status of not us, predominantly wealthy white elites. But those are kind of some of the moments that I remember having touched off some of the local sort of police reform movements. The thing I want to say is that in response to all of these things, we've been asking nicely for years. We've gone through the proper channels. We participated in endless studies and roundtables and town halls and city council meetings. We met with leaders and we presented our case with showers of data and polite language. We asked for community policing and TPD refused. They refused to even serve on a committee that had actual community members on it. And the result of that was a meaningless list of recommendations that made no tangible changes. We asked for special meetings through the Demanding a Just Tulsa campaign on the staggering disparities in the quality indicators data. And we were first met with the city attorney claiming that there were conflicts of interest, which was absurd. And then we were met with the council chair refusing to use the special meeting privileges that the city council had, simply because he didn't want to subpoena law enforcement because he thought that was just impolite. And then later we were met with the larger council's unwillingness to actually act in favor of anything and instead just have more endless meetings. We asked politely for an OIM, just to have a shred of democratic oversight over our largest publicly funded institution in this city. And all we were met with was hostility. And we are currently in the process of yet another study convened by and held by another pro-police think tank who are being paid $500,000. So I say all that to say that it has become clear to me that all of these methods, the proper channels, are just designed to manage and silence dissent and accountability. Reform is not going to get us there because the system is working as it's designed. Criminalizing Blackness and mental illness and poverty and queerness is a feature of the system. It's not a flaw. And carceral feminism is not going to serve us when it comes to liberation.
Well, what I'll add, just a little bit of evidence to what Mana laid out, because I was there. I was there in 2016 when Terrence Crutcher was killed. And as a child of this community, it struck me so deeply that I ended my national political career and came home to get to work. I was there when Betty Shelby was acquitted, even though we all saw the video. I was there when Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, along with her incredible family, said that they were going to use the murder of their brother and son and father, uncle, nephew, to push for policies so that this would never happen again. I was there when we researched, along with national experts from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Human Rights Watch, the issues in policing, and issued national recommendations. I was there when we organized with community members, asked them what they thought needed to happen to create better relationships between police and the community, what they thought needed to happen to decrease the inequities that were so clear in reports like the equality indicators. I was there when Mayor Bynum announced that even he thought that a best practice should be used in following the Denver model of the Office of the Independent Monitor. I was there when it took them too long. I was there on the streets after George Floyd died, and all of a sudden, we remembered that we had a policing issue in Tulsa as well. So I was there on the highways. I was there in City Hall when Mayor Bynum looked at a group of 50 community members and every resident of the city of Tulsa on every news station and agreed to our simple demands of creating that Office of the Independent Monitor, of divesting and enforcement so that we could invest in mental health resources to actually help our community, to settle the cases, not just of Terrence Crutcher, but also of Joshua Barre and Joshua Harvey. 3 unarmed Black men, all suffering, frankly, more from a mental health issue, if anything, than wanting to cause harm, all killed by law enforcement. And I was there when community members were trying to make good on the negotiation agreement that they thought they had with Mayor Bynum, and instead walked into a meeting to see Mayor Bynum with the heads of the Fraternal Order of Police, clearly signaling whose side he was on and whose side the city of Tulsa was on. I was there when community members demanded, finally, after years and years of a police chief that wasn't listening, demanded a community-based process. Maybe this time we could start over, start again, start anew, start fresh. I was there when Mayor Bynum decided that he was the community. He was going to decide who could select. He was going to decide out of the 4 finalists, all out of the very police department that we've been having these issues with. And then I was there when our current police chief had his first community meeting, and which was, to my knowledge, the last that he had. And I've been there on email chains when he's refused to meet with anyone, quote unquote, that isn't friendly to the police department. So I've been there from beginning to end in terms of, over the past 5 years, the very clear steps that Mana had laid out, that community members have taken, and then seeing the backpedaling, seeing the excuses that have constantly been thrown at us, and frankly, this fake war that is tried to be created as if community members have some sort of hatred in their heart. We don't have hatred in our hearts. What we have is love for ourselves and our dignity and our humanity. And if we hate anything, it is the fact that we're continued to be looked at as less than, continue to be over policed, and as I say all the time, viewed and it feels like to me almost terrorized by people who should be supporting us. So 2021 is here, 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre, and the parallel that I would like to draw is the cover up, the continued lies, and the purposeful ignorance of a system that is supposed to protect its citizens. That is the same reason that just a few weeks ago, in response to what happened to the OIM, we heard, oh, don't worry about it. We've got an internal review of internal affairs. That was the sentence that was stated. Our solution is an internal review of internal affairs. So if that doesn't show you just how little a chance there is for power to give itself up, right, without demand, then I don't know what to tell you. You have a long way to go, but we are not where we're at because of a lack of trying by community, and I do think that's important to point out.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for sharing that history and for bringing all the people's names who have been harmed and murdered by members of this community who have not been held accountable and who have been supposedly entrusted with public safety. Thank you for bringing them to space. Thank you for connecting it both to the near history as well as to Tulsa's longer history, and for making it clear that this isn't just something that's happening, conversations that need to happen elsewhere in the community or in the country, or that have been happening elsewhere in the country. It's been very real for folks living in Tulsa. So I want to turn to Molly. If you can talk a little bit about the work around ending 287G and just briefly explain what 287G is, and then also explain why it's necessary to talk about why it's necessary to discuss immigration enforcement in conversations about defunding and divesting from the police.
Absolutely. So immigration enforcement has to be part of the conversation when talking about defunding and divesting, because we're talking about law enforcement, and no matter what the badge looks like, the enforcement just contributes to everything else. It contributes to the separation of families. There's disproportionate punishment on vulnerable populations, no matter what level of law enforcement you look at. There's brutality at the hands of the state, no matter what level and badge you look at. And honestly, both police and immigration enforcement historically are just completely rooted in racial bias and oppression. That's the creation for both systems. I think immigration enforcement gets kind of left out of the conversation often because they're less visible. So you don't see immigration enforcement if you are not a person of color. You're not going to see immigration enforcement if you're not already in our county jail. So they are more secretive by design. Law or immigration enforcement is discreet by design, and so they just get left out of the conversation because they're not around. They're not visibly around like local law enforcement can look like. But briefly, 287G, which Mana has briefly mentioned, I'll just explain as quick as possible. 287G is a contract between the immigration enforcement, so ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and any local law enforcement entity. In Tulsa, that is our Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. It could be municipal places, but it's often county sheriff's offices. It's a contract and it's an agreement that our Tulsa County Sheriff's deputies can be deputized as ICE. So they're working under Tulsa County Sheriff's offices. We're paying for them with our tax money still, and they are operating as ICE. So this leads to so many more people in our community who are undocumented or semi-documented, or who look like they may be undocumented. This puts so many more people at risk. So with 287G, if you are brought in to the jail for any offense whatsoever, it can be a traffic offense, it can be murder. It can also be, it can be anything. And you've been charged, but you haven't been convicted of any crime whatsoever. You are immediately, as soon as you cross the threshold of the jail, you are immediately at risk of deportation. And it depends on our Tulsa County Sheriff's deputies if you will be put into deportation proceedings. Historically, you were just put into deportation proceedings. So 287G is incredibly harmful for our community. It puts everyone at risk. So, I mean, if people don't feel comfortable reaching out to, like, right now we have law enforcement, right, that are supposed to respond to emergencies. We know what that looks like. But people aren't going to reach out if they know the consequences of that very clearly. So the work to end 287G began the moment it was signed in Tulsa County. So people have been working on this, really mobilizing, I'll use the word mobilizing, around this, ending this contract since 2007, since it was signed. And it's had varying degrees of momentum depending on what's going on in Tulsa, depending on what's going on nationally. My work started around like 2018, maybe, because I was working with all of these women who had been caught up under 287G. So it's all these people who really could have just served their time, if they were ever convicted, served their time, and then released back into the community, or just gone back home because they were never actually convicted of any crime. So I started asking the people I was working with, what can I do? And they didn't even know what policy they were being like isolated by. So I did my research, had heard about 287G, and started bringing them that information. Like, did you know this is why you're still here? And most people didn't know. So doing some education around like even what's happening in their own lives, because they didn't have access to any of that information on the inside. But we started really ramping up our activism around ending 287G, because every year the county re-signs the contract. So every year the county says, yes, we want to keep this. And they can cancel it at any time they want. But every June is whenever like some more like mobilization happens around shedding light on what's going on. So I teamed up with some like activist lawyers and immigrant activists in the community to do kind of like a community education tour where we just went around and said like, hey, I know you've heard about this. Let's like dig into what it actually is and what it looks like. And at the same time, holding meetings with county commissioners and the sheriff's office and trying to do everything like the right way, which led to just like tons of gaslighting. We had like, like actual data, and then we would be presented with like a Word document with some numbers on it. And it was like, it was baffling. I mean, just like the level of skills that many people had in creating their own evidence, I guess. But we found, that wasn't gonna work. Doing things just in the manner that we were told we needed to. So we shifted tactics and did some more direct actions and protests, taking over the county commissioners' meetings, but at the same time, still doing outreach in the community around what this looks like. So it had like varying degrees of success, but It's still technically a contract in Tulsa County. It's not being used. And that was done in a really, the contract doesn't make money for the county, but there was a complementary contract that's also bad that made all the money. And they decided, well, we're not going to cancel 287G for whatever reasons you all want to imagine, but we are going to cancel the one thing that makes money for it. So then 287G is not often used anymore. But it was definitely a lesson for a lot of us in what kind of, like, how flexible you need to be in actually organizing people, how deep the knowledge needs to be. So like, not just wanting to end something because of a few stories, but like really getting into the nitty-gritty of it, because the county commissioners, I mean, they knew their stuff, but honestly, we ended up knowing all of it better than they did by the end of it. And that gave us leverage that I think we were surprised about. Yeah.
I want to add I want to zoom out a little bit. Molly gave such a good summary of like what it looked like on the ground. And I want to kind of zoom out and just talk about sort of the origins of these kinds of policies and how the carceral state kind of operates really insidiously, specifically related to carceral feminism. And what I want to point out is that, you know, what's on a lot of our minds right now is this like catastrophically terrible occupation of Afghanistan that we are now like extricating ourselves from, right? And of course now we have families who are being displaced from their homelands because of terrible American foreign policy. How does this relate to anything we just talked about? Well, what is coming to light is the role that sort of big feminism, like the banner women's rights organizations, which were primarily or almost entirely white feminist organizations, and the role that they played in supporting our occupation of Afghanistan around in the post 9/11 era. And if you know, people who are paying attention to immigration policy know that there was a huge shift after 9/11. Like things like the Department of Homeland Security didn't exist before we created this war on terror, right? So we used things like 9/11 to rationalize foreign occupation, the militarization of the border, and the militarization of our local law enforcement. So the fact that TPD has tanks is directly a result of these like absurd policies rooted in mythological things like war on terror. And we rationalize things like American imperialism and going into Iraq and Afghanistan because we're like liberating oppressed women from Islam, right? So I want to like just point out that like these things are all interconnected. The other side knows exactly what they're doing. Like all of this is by design. And so it's really important for us to not make the mistake of sort of siloing our issues. So I'm glad, Molly, that you mentioned that like this is not something that we can afford not to talk about, just like we can't afford not to talk about the implications of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the fact that Indigenous sovereignty is overlooked when it comes to too many of our, you know, anti-violence programs. I'm going to defer to you to say more about that, but I just really want to make those links really explicit.
Thank you both. And that's such a phenomenal segue into the next question, which is, what is the role of carceral feminism and carceral feminist narratives in working to demobilize or to counter the work being done by activists and by organizers and by the folks who are being harmed by the policies, by the policing and by the immigration policies that we've been talking about? And I'll just throw that out too. We've already heard a few, but I'll just throw that out and would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I will say, so my background has a lot been in the anti-violence movement. So domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, and carceral feminism is so interwoven into the mainstream anti-violence movement. And there's like a whole history behind it. Like it was to legitimize these crimes. And so for so long, feminists were saying like, this is not like the personal is political, right? Like this is happening in our homes and being treated as something that doesn't affect the community, but like they wanted to legitimize this, to have people who are causing harm held accountable. Well, that happened to be a lot of white feminists who were saying, okay, let's align ourselves with the legal system. We need this to be in like legal law, that this is wrong and there needs to be harsh punishments. So carceral feminism is just like so interwoven. And even though that was like 1970s, it's still how the movement operates today. And so like everything from us like typically having a law enforcement officer on boards of directors, being required by the major, like there are 2 major grants that come to provide for all domestic violence services, no matter who you are, mainstream or not. All of them require participation and partnerships with local law enforcement. So they need to be on like committees that you have, they need to be a part of the work. And that's absolutely required and checked on. And then, you know, we like embed our advocates within the court system, but really on one side of the court system. The advocates are there to advocate for victims, but they're there truly to advocate for harsher punishments and longer sentences. And in like the work around just like carceral feminism here in Oklahoma, district attorneys have done such a good job of co-opting language of carceral feminists, because they know that victims advocates they're going to be some really close friends of theirs. So if they use that language of carceral feminism, if they call themselves, you know, these like, I like to think they often think of themselves as like expert protectors of the community. I know I make that face too, Mana, but they will call themselves that. Like they're there to ensure that women are protected. But what they really mean, and those of us who work in the anti-violence field know what they mean by women are protected. They mean like white women, right? It's not, and it's white women who have themselves somewhat put together, who are sad, who are very demure, and who are polite and very grateful. And that's laughable only because like that's such a small percentage of people, but that's like the language of the DA. So they really have like created this dichotomy of victim and offender, good guy, bad guy. And to me, that's so much of carceral feminism is like putting people within this dichotomy and never recognizing that people are complex human beings, that the victims are not always the pure victims that DAs believe, and the offenders are often not these like monsters that they are portrayed as, but it's a really easy sell. It's much easier and quicker to believe in that way because you're not looking at the gray of people and you're able to say this person deserves this punishment for this long because they're bad. So I just feel like carceral feminism we've really dug ourselves into a hole, because getting out of that, even doing the 287G movement, I was working at an anti-violence agency, and the pressure that law enforcement that we worked with put on our agency for the fact that I was outspoken about this was powerful. And thankfully we had really smart leaders who were like, yeah, this pretty much aligns with our mission, so we're not gonna do anything. But law enforcement has become one of the powers that be in this work, and that's really terrifying.
Is there a follow-up question, Vic? I don't want to. Oh, I can answer.
I go for it.
I think what you said was so poignant, and for me, particularly in some of the campaigns. I think it was State Question 805 was a good example of, I mean, I had the privilege of being in on some of those early conversations. And I think we talk a lot about well-intentioned people. I think there's a lot of well-intentioned people in the world. I think that we fall victim to these narratives and these games, right? Especially good-hearted people. And so the amount of time that was spent on what can we say and what can't we say, and the biggest people in the room who weren't in the room were the domestic violence folks, right? Which the argument for any sane person wasn't that we want to let a bunch of domestic violence offenders. That wasn't it. But it was the reality that that was going to be the message that was screamed from the hilltops. The example, though, that I want to talk about is this is all about money. It's not about some moral high ground that these people have. You just talked about it with 287G. All of a sudden, you end the money contract, and all of a sudden, they don't even care about 287G no more, right? I think that that's why when I think about what has to be done in policing, and Vic, I know you're going here on this next question, is let's get to the root of why law enforcement is what it is, as prevalent as it is. Let's get to the root of why district attorneys act the way they act right now. The prisons are privatized. Our judicial system runs off of everything from fines and fees to keeping you in jail for as long as possible, and then those fees that come with that. Our police department and county law enforcement are substantiated off of fear, right? This is a money game. And so to me, the answer to that is start putting the money somewhere else. And then all of a sudden, problems will just disappear. It's amazing how if all of a sudden the money has to go to actually helping people with issues, the money has to go to actually investing in resources that will create more prominent communities, so you don't put people in desperate situations where there's more stresses and more pressures that lead to these types of crimes. All of a sudden, then, not only is there less of a necessity for law enforcement, but you're going to get to a point where folks are like, nah, we don't need to talk about that. We need to talk about this big money game over here, which is mental health support and things like that. I'm bringing that up because we know that this is what the world revolves around. And so oftentimes we play this moral game, and we get caught in this trap of trying to out-moral the other side when they're just playing a dollars and cents game. So no matter what you say, they're going to find another reason to write another check to a law enforcement agency or to protect the money that's already in the carceral system and the judicial system. I think that the language thing is important, right? What is Make America Great Again? I promise I'm not going to be too much longer. Make America Great Again is Make America White Again. What was the war on drugs? The war on drugs was the war on Black people, right? Language. So to me, fine. If the communities that you're in don't like defund or divest, then just change it. Just change it then to invest, because that's all they do. And when they try to say, oh, this is just this campaign, no, it's not. This is an invest camp. Just like the war on drugs wasn't a war against Black people, just a war on drugs. Right? Like, we have to start playing with the same weapons and being as aggressive as they are in terms of doing what needs to be done to get us to the place we need to go. That's really the reflection that I'm having after years and years and years of, frankly, being frustrated by saying, here is the data, here is the best practice, here is the pathway to get there, and then all you get in response is a reason why we can't do that. That has no basis in reality.
I hands down agree. And I think one of that like investment pieces that our community and our state honestly does not do is around prevention. Like we are so reactive to the issues that there is not funding. People will not fund, right, prevention mechanisms because it's not sexy. And it doesn't get people like really excited. And that's the shame.
At the risk of being the curmudgeon, and I am the old lady here, so I take privilege in being, I take the right to be a curmudgeon here. I honestly believe that it doesn't matter how much it costs. I think as long as we believe that law enforcement, you know, as long as we legitimate law enforcement as being protectors of anything, and you know, the quiet part that no one speaks out loud is the only thing they protect is private property, right? They don't protect people, they don't protect lives, they protect capitalism. And so there's no amount of money that's gonna that is going to be too much for leaders to spend in order to maintain, you know, this tool of white supremacist capitalism. Like there isn't and the reason we don't invest in prevention is because we're not actually interested in solving problems. Like I think what we need to do is reject the premise that a lot of these lawmakers are using, because as long as we like engage them on their terms, their stated terms, the text and not the subtext, they're always gonna jujitsu their way out of it, because they're always going to be able to like find some new way to rationalize the thing that they say. They don't actually care about money. They don't actually care about economics. They care about oppression. They care about racism. They care about controlling people, right? They want to be able to control the bodies of people who they're scared of and who serve them. So I guess I don't have a lot of hope that like simply, you know, offering better ideas is going to do it. I think that's why I'm such a firm abolitionist. Like we just need to tear the whole thing down.
To me, everything is a marketing campaign though. Right? And so how do you market with abolition? I mean, I'm just going to go with you for a second. What's the marketing campaign on it? Like we're sitting in a country that has literally marketed itself as the country of freedom and of opportunity, even though there is zero evidence in its history of any of that occurring. Think about that. We marketed ourselves to being the most free and fair country on earth. And all we have done is built a country of incredible inequity off the backs of people of color from all different backgrounds. I'm not just one. Most countries, they just have one group of people that they oppress. In America, we just done oppressed everybody. Think about that now. You can't even own oppression in America because you look to your left, this person got oppressed yesterday, that person gonna get oppressed tomorrow. But the marketing is impeccable. We are the greatest marketers on earth. And so I'm simply saying, and it probably is because I'm a little bit younger and I'm still feisty and I feel like fighting and I want to win, that I'm like, okay, if that's what this is, then let's just play the marketing game, right? Let's just try to control the narratives at every aspect as much as possible until maybe we can fool, if everybody's out here being fooled, then let's just try our luck at fooling folks. And what I guess my frustration is, it's like eventually when the other side just gonna keep on lying and lying and lying, then what are you going to do at that point? Like when are you going to say, oh no, the pot is gonna be bigger and nicer over here too? That's all I'm saying is I just get frustrated with the fact that because everything you said is correct, because of that, they get to lie and it be taken as fact. And then just because all of them believe it, because they need to out of fear, then that just becomes gospel. You know, that to me is just, it's just a bridge. It's a bridge too far. So yeah, I want to tear it down, but when I tear it down, I want a lot of people to be tearing it down with me.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we have to out-organize the other side. The only way we get there is if we get people with us, right? That's like the only way. There's no other way. We can't outspend them. We have to out-organize them. And I think narrative work and marketing, you can call it that, or comms or narrative or whatever you want. I think it starts with not conceding to the terms of the opposite side when they say, well, we're the ones here keeping you safe, right? I think we need to be ready to say, you're keeping nobody safe, right? You're not even keeping your own people safe. Like, how many cops are beating their wives? Like, there's no safety in proximity to law enforcement, none. And we need to stop pretending like we can sort of reform our way to law enforcement being safe. We have to reject the notion that law enforcement does anything to keep anybody safe. And I think that's the problem with carceral feminism, is that it ultimately believes that we need these institutions to protect us, and that the job of these institutions is to protect us. And so if we just course correct a little bit, suddenly we will unlock something in them that's been there all along, that will suddenly keep us safe. And it's like, no, we just need to reject the premise and say, no, this isn't working. This isn't working. Anytime we create new laws, all we do is like reify the legitimacy of an institution that is morally bankrupt and like a death machine. So I'm with you. I'm 100% with you, Greg. Like, I just think we need to start that marketing campaign needs to start with a very like real look at like, what is it that what terms are they speaking on? And we need to stop speaking on their terms.
I totally agree. I mean, I think that whenever like talking about like, okay, well, what do you do with, I keep going back to sexual violence, but it's what law enforcement talks a lot about too. But like, so what do we do without law enforcement? Whenever you start to like really tell people, well, like this is actually what happens during law enforcement. You give them, not the law enforcement themselves, but you give the community information around like what safety actually looks like whenever law enforcement are around, or when immigration enforcement are around. It's super uncomfortable, right? It's like totally goes against what so many people believe. And so it's really uncomfortable, but that's actually been like the key to getting people to understand not just the financial side of it, not just like, I value this, but also like what is actually happening on the ground. And I just feel like that's where people started to like, where the cracks started to show. And also I'd love to burn it all down too.
I want to kind of connect a couple of threads, because I think there are some really important pieces that have happened. One of which is there's both the role of like internal and external carceral feminism. So that external piece is that big narrative that poses white women as this entity that needs to be protected, and they are protected at all costs, and that can justify tremendous amounts of violence all around the world. And then there's also that internal piece, which is law enforcement is literally embedded in the organizations that are actually supposed to be there to respond to violence when it happens, and are preventing those organizations from responding to violence when it happens, and are preventing those organizations oftentimes from doing the prevention work and having the conversations that need to be had. So it's both those forces are really powerful. The other kind of thread that I heard that I have the peacemaker gene that like can't let people disagree and wants them to like see that they're unified, no self-control over it. So is the piece that it's the use of the weaponization of victim stories and of victimhood and the idea of victims and the ways that we conceptualize what a good victim is and what it isn't. It's the use of that narrative to preserve and continue to collect resources for the carceral state and for the policing system to then protect people's wealth. Like, they're not going and using those resources to support survivors. Like, that work is being done in communities. It's being done every single day, and it's being done brilliantly every single day. It's being used to protect wealth. And it's this they're gathering resources because it allows them to continue doing what they've been doing. And so I so appreciate, I think that was in all of your things. And I think so much of the need to like switch the narrative and to really emphasize how much this isn't about public safety and it's not about protecting people. It's about control and it's about protecting wealth and it's about obtaining wealth. And there's so much money in the carceral state. Oh my goodness. So I want to give just a second because I know I saw a couple folks kind of like reaching for mouses. So if anyone else wants to add a piece before we move on and start kind of wrapping up this conversation. Okay. So let's get a little bit more like, I'm having to like choose questions. So a little bit more like what has, I have to choose my question now. This is hard, y'all. This is so good. Okay. What about Tulsa makes doing kind of an explicit campaign around defunding or divesting particularly difficult? And what could make that easier? Like what is the work that can be done on that front?
To me, you're in a city that literally can't admit that it sanctioned the murder of its own citizens. You're in a, like, not 100 years ago, I'm talking about like 2 years ago, right? We admit nothing. We can do no wrong. We have the opposite of a history of taking bold action. We have a history codified in our bones of cover up, of protect white supremacy at all costs, like no matter what. It is in the DNA. And so even from, I'm talking about like even from people who are impacted, the trauma is so deep. We don't even have the wide breadth of what you would categorize as sort of radical movement leaders and organizers within the DNA of the city, because for so long that was just a death sentence. So I think like the organizers that I work with, we're actually, if you dropped us in another city, moderate. Even if you hear me today, like I'm the least radical person on this panel, and I'm not mad about that. I just am, right? Yet in the city of Tulsa, like I'm one of the faces of, you know, bringing Armageddon on the city, right? So that's damaging because there actually isn't enough organizing and enough educating on what might it look like if you were to abolish? What might it look like if you were just to totally reimagine something, right? And when that happens, then campaigns that are mild, like divest, invest, become, oh my God, incredibly radical. You can't even say that anymore. And that's why, to me, it becomes so difficult for those to gain wide traction. There just is not the wide breadth of organizing and understanding. And I think it has a lot to do with the trauma of this city as a whole. Last thing I'll say is that's why I'm such an advocate of saying we have to actually at some point speak truth to ourselves and begin to heal. If we do it on one thing, what the city will realize is we're not gonna die. Like we're not gonna fall apart. Actually, we'll actually see that when we do it, everybody will feel better. It's like when you finally admit that you were wrong, and then after you're like, dang, like we just haven't been able to do it. Not one time. We haven't done it yet. And until then, I think there's just gonna be a struggle with these types of campaigns.
I also think Tulsa is has a lot of really powerful, wealthy people who control our city. And so there hasn't been like this structure of, or this foundation of organizing, because philanthropies have come in to say, oh, no, you don't need to organize. We got a new program that's just going to take care of it. And it's bonkers how much they control. And so, as also, it's just completely in their best interest to maintain the status quo, right? To create little programs that create more wealth for them, and that temporarily, get some attention and put a Band-Aid on an issue. Again, never addressing the actual root causes of the issue. And then also for people on the ground doing this work, there are nonprofits, right, who are like, hey, this law enforcement thing really isn't working out. We'd really love to try something different. But the only way to do that in an organized way within the city is through a nonprofit, which is just a puppet of the foundations. So having lived other places, I know that philanthropies are everywhere, right? But Tulsa is a very different place. And our love of the large foundations is completely different than anywhere I've ever been. And I think that greatly hinders our ability to think outside the box, much less to abolish these systems.
There's literally more money here from the philanthropies than anywhere else. I mean, literally more money. And even within the philanthropies, the structures that are supposedly liberal, that we partner with, I partner with yesterday and tomorrow, when you ask them to stand with you on this issue, just come to the press conference. That's all you got to do. Just write the letter and we can change the power dynamic. It just will not occur. It doesn't occur. And I'm putting it out there so they can hear it, but it's just weird that we can be aligned on everything until it's time to say something or do something. We're aligned when we're getting the check. We're aligned when we have to make the argument for where we're going. When we're talking about the impact we're trying to make. But then when those investments come to fruition and people like myself and others are like, hey, we use this money now, we ready to like, we ready to like put the money, put the action to it. That's when all of a sudden these people with all this power, all of a sudden they have no power, no influence. They can do nothing. It's the weirdest thing to me. So I'm throwing it out there to y'all. Maybe Mana knows, but I get confused.
Well, when we were talking earlier about like what the carceral feminist narratives are, and Molly was talking about how deeply embedded that is in the DV world, like that's not an accident, right? Like domestic violence services are something that was manufactured by the nonprofit industrial complex. The NGOization, the social servicization of the anti-violence movement was a thing that happened because of philanthropy. By the way, required reading. I see my book club friends in the chat. So like, yep, there we go. Everybody get it. But the fact that the anti-violence movement, which was largely a woman of color led movement and like queer and trans led movement, got co-opted by philanthropy and turned into a social service sector that then prevents social change from happening is not an accident. Like what you're describing, Greg, is like the playbook, right? Like we have convinced ourselves because of philanthropy that we can social service our way out of structural problems. And all that does is that it individualizes these systemic issues. So it's sort of like, oh, these poor folks are just broken. And isn't it great that we have magnanimously decided to help fix them and save them from themselves and their bad decisions? Gosh, if only they weren't so stupid, but I guess they are. So, and by the way, philanthropies treat nonprofit workers the same way. Like the folks inside the nonprofits are also treated like the help, like they're barely like functioning children. And then their clients are the actual children. And all of that is designed to maintain power. Like none of that is accidental. Of course, they don't actually want to change systems. That's not what they're there for. They're there to have tax shelters and, you know, maintain the power structure of their fund, of their the family money that it comes from, or the corporate money that it comes from. And then they can vote blue and feel good about themselves. Like,
and I mean, all that would have to happen, I like to think in simplicity. Literally tomorrow, if it was like the new hot thing in philanthropy is stop investing in police departments and reimagine the safety of our communities. Like it would, like overnight, that it would be that quick. So it's like, the funniest thing to me is to watch really rich, powerful people in the country of the really rich and powerful be so confused about how to make change. Me, I can be confused. I'm Black and poor. I can be confused. You, rich and powerful, how are you confused about how to? I don't get it. Literally, organizing is trying to figure out how to organically, like, get what you have when you wake up every day. So it is a practice, and so it feels like you're beating yourself against the wall because you're like, either I'm just really, really dumb, you know, or I'm being bamboozled here, right? And so back to, I mean, to the question, Vic, like it's really hard. It really what it shows you is that I was actually having this conversation before, like somebody else. It's like what actually changes things. The only thing that actually ever changes things is pain, like pain in a way where you're just like, we can no longer tolerate it. That's the only thing in the history of America that has ever actually generated real substantial change, is creating so much pain and discomfort that it can't be tolerated. That's why the one weapon that we've seen is successful is negative press, because it's just so discomforting that it makes them, you know, oh, well, we have to give them something, right? We have to give them something. And so I think, like, probably the answer to your question is, when the roots of this is white supremacy, and when that's what we uphold above all, anything that threatens to challenge that is a no-go. It doesn't matter how cute the words are or anything else. It just, you literally, it cannot happen. You know, it becomes very, very difficult. Go ahead.
One of the things that I can't remember which brilliant Black woman taught me, but one of the brilliant Black women who I learned from on the internet taught me is that white supremacy is infantilizing, right? So when suddenly all of these powerful people who have answers all the time are like unsure of what to do, like that's them allowing, like manufacturing ignorance and needing to then be like coddled and supported and treated with kid gloves. Like that is absurd, right? It's like exactly what you said. It's absurd to think that people who know how to get literally everything done, who can literally just like go knock on their neighbor's door because that's their senator, or like, like go over to the next table over at the country club and be like, hey, how's that blah, 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 decision that you're about to make that's going to affect millions of people? How's that going? What if you did it this way? Like, they're not clueless. They're just infantilizing themselves and weaponizing their incompetence in order to prevent change from happening, because change is scary to them. That's not like, that's all by design. Yes, exactly. They know exactly how to get shit done because they get it done all the time. Sorry, I lasted an hour and 15 minutes without dropping any profanities. I think I should get an award, and I'm sorry I just did that.
I think it's well used. I want to draw on something that you said at the beginning of what you were talking about, Greg, which was the historical trauma and the fact that the foundations in Tulsa so often use the direct services to respond to that trauma, but it's in such a way that, as Mana said, it's individualized and it prevents mobilization. It also prevents communities from ever getting the resources that they need to enable radicalization and mobilization. You don't even need to say radicalization, just like being able to do the work, because it's so often when there are resources, they're so, well, you have to be in this zip code and you need to have these things and you have to have all these life circumstances. And it's not about actually supporting the community and allowing healing.
Vic, if they just picked the 5 smartest people of color and gave them all the money that they were going to try and give out themselves, we'd be in a better spot. I mean, the fact that you can't even get money without a program. Think about that. I know most of the people on this call working nonprofit. We have to make up, we're all lying. We have to make up how much a program costs, how many staff you need, just so you can feed your families that you're trying to serve and feed the people who are trying to serve the families. We got to make it up. Okay. You can't even, if you go tell the truth that I'm trying to get a bunch of dedicated, smart people in one space so we can begin to kind of work these problems out and figure out how to make this thing work. Oh my, what is that? You don't have any structure. They start throwing everything. You the dumbest person ever. Right. And so, and then what's so funny to me is we'll spend years and years overlooking the people who actually might be able to do something or might actually be proximate and say, oh, well, they just don't have this and that. When all you had to do was call them in and train them. You act like the college student that just walked out of some big university who drank half of their career is somehow more qualified to get training than this person who been on the streets finding out how to survive every dang day. Like, all it is a racket. I mean, it's the biggest pimp racket I done seen since I got to get on marijuana, because now marijuana is the biggest racket. But before we legalized marijuana and you got legalized drug dealers now, we was pimping the nonprofit industry. My point about the marijuana deal is this. It's just I'm still frustrated at the fact that, like, we just locked up all my cousins, and then y'all, like, Vic, give me just 1 second. Okay. My cousins were the last on the chain. We weren't the growers, not the distributors, nothing. We were just the last one, nickel and diamond. If you was really lucky, you was like the American plug, not even the real plug. Okay, once it became legal, now you locked them up, killed them, destroyed them, everything. Once it became legal, white people became the whole industry. They the plug, the distributor, the seller, the attorney, the accountant, everything. Everything.
And guess what you can't have if you want to run a dispensary? You can't have a drug conviction.
Can't have it. So we can't be in the industry. Never mind. Y'all understand how that story goes. So it's just, I'm using that as an example to say, so I see so many smart people kill themselves every day in a system that is literally rigged to where there's no possible way they're gonna win. That's what frustrates me. And so, like, I mean, to Mana's point, like, I look at it and say, it's too scary. It's too scary for most people. I'm just gonna talk to y'all like how I think about it. It's too scary for me to go out there and be like, you really don't need this police department. Not because it's not true, but because it's too much to handle for most people. but I don't think it's too much to tell like the nonprofit industry, for instance, like the philanthropists, like, y'all really don't have to do this way though. Like, it's one thing to try to turn around the whole prison industrial complex overnight, but it's actually not that big a deal to do that, in my opinion, on the philanthropic side. And the reason I focused there is because once you do that, now all of a sudden the energies, there's money, there's resources, there's space to begin actually propping up alternatives, right? Like, just being like, you know what, we're just going to try this differently in our community. Y'all don't even have to do it. We'll just try it differently here. And I know that there are organizations and foundations within the city of Tulsa, Terrence Crutcher Foundation for one, who is literally making that argument. You know what, we'll just build up something for ourselves in hopes of one day saying, look, this works here. Imagine if it was done citywide and we didn't have to have law enforcement as it currently states, right? And so I want to add that angle in there, because that's where I've had to put my energy and frustration in, because I don't necessarily see the ultimate success in like an abolition campaign in Tulsa. I'm gonna be the first one on the list. I'm not trying to crap on it. I'm just saying, in the meantime, right, we can certainly abolish the dumb way we doing philanthropy right now.
I appreciate that like the maybe using the abolition framework isn't the most, for most people that seems really radical, but I think in so many ways actually each of you have named work that is the work, which is giving the resources to the communities that are most affected and trusting the people most harmed by these systems and most harmed by violence and most harmed by our structures of oppression, and giving them the resources and saying, we trust you. Like, you're actually already doing this work. You're already doing the community care. And we're going to just trust you to do that work because you've done it forever and you're brilliant at it. You're just often prevented from doing it by these systems and by these narratives that say this isn't the right way or this isn't correct or whatever. That's how you come off mute, Mama. Go for it.
There's a concept in political science that has to do with like the window of like acceptable political discourse. It's called the Overton window. That's for the super nerdy among you. But the idea is like the Overton window is like, if this is all of the ideas in the world, right, about things that could happen, the Overton window is like what we as a society right now consider acceptable, right? And we can play inside this window, and like, you know, conservatives will be on one end of it and liberals will be on another end of it. And, you know, it's probably three-dimensional, but in any case. And I want to go back to something that Greg said earlier, that like, comparatively speaking, a lot of the things that we do here in Tulsa would be considered smack in the middle of another town's Overton window, but are like way on the left of ours, right? And I think some of the work here, some of the narrative work, some of the sort of mind or the consciousness raising work is like expanding that window, or at least shifting it enough. And I think a lot of what we do when we try and like massage our language to be palatable is we actually do ourselves a disservice, because we're not creating a wide enough set of options for people to play inside of. And it actually it's a failure of imagination. Like, we need to give people the opportunity to imagine big. And so I think, you know, a lot of people say defund the police failed because it was too scary. I'm like, no, man, it was a moonshot. Like, we needed to say, like, here are the opportunities, here are the, you know, because otherwise, you know, what Greg said earlier, you said something about like, you know, fear is what challenges people. Like, you have to make things unacceptable or something along those lines in order for people to change their behavior. It's like, you have to make some things so untenable that they're no longer a thing that people can do anymore without feeling ashamed. And the idea is, and I'm not trying to correct you, Greg, I'm just giving, you know, another layer of this. And it's just thinking about like, what are ways that we can expand the consciousness and the imagining of people. And maybe the primary campaign and in the halls of power, we don't say we are abolitionists who are looking to dismantle the carceral state. but someone needs to say that so that the people who are actually, in community can actually have some new language to play around with and new ideas. Otherwise, we just trap ourselves into small thinking. And I think that is something that happens in Tulsa all the time. We just have this like tyranny of small ideas. And I mean, the thing that I was so excited about, around Greg's campaign is that it just allowed us to think, what could a Tulsa look like that isn't run by the same tiny elite, circle? And like, it just, just like, it was so energizing just to be able to play around with new ideas, right? And so I think we have to make it untenable to have certain ideas, like just exactly what you were saying about funding. Like, it should be embarrassing for our foundations to fund such a small amount of organizing and political work, to fund so few, BIPOC-led organizations, to fund, so little by way of social change and only social service. Like, that should be kind of embarrassing. And I think the thing around the thing that the George Floyd summer really catalyzed was people taking things that they had sort of taken for granted and suddenly going, oh, maybe our all white board is like maybe not okay anymore, and it was like, yeah, we've been telling y'all, but like, okay, whatever it takes. Now you're embarrassed about it. Great. And so I just feel like there's an opportunity there to play around a little bit and like push against that risk aversion.
No, I think you're exactly right. And I think that education is critical to campaign. I think one of the things probably the most important piece of any organizing campaign is the education that goes around the issue. And I think that's why organizing is such a slow and respectful work, right? And I think that that's where it really does become a stair-step process. So for all of those reasons, it's absolutely correct. Like that what can the world look like? Ideas that if they don't get said now, there's not a chance for them in 5 years. There's not a chance for them in 10 years, right? I just want to stamp that. I think that's exactly right. And I think that that's when there can become a kind of a strategic way to attack from this side of the fence, right? And so I mean, I agree, and that's where I think my frustration comes with liberal money in Tulsa, is that when liberal money funds conservative ideas, you don't have a shot. Like you're basically saying, I mean, I know y'all understand what I mean. So I agree. And I think, yes, it probably starts with people saying, hey, this is our line and we're going to hold it. I think we said it a lot, like, this is our line and we're going to hold this line so that we can get as close to that line as possible. I think that's, I think I agree with that for sure.
So I think I could, and I think probably everyone here could like listen to you all talk for hours, but we have 2 minutes left. So if you'll each briefly kind of what's next, what can people do? You have 45 seconds each. Like, what's the dream? What can we do? What does this actually look like?
Well, for me, I'll start. I was saying earlier that somebody told me that, hey, when you get on something like this, you're ruining your chances of being elected. And I actually made me more excited for the conversation. I think that one of the things that somebody like myself can do is be like, nah, we gonna have this kind of conversation. Because ultimately, if people like myself aren't willing to do that, then we aren't gonna get anywhere, because there's always gonna be a cop out and somebody that you can say, oh, well, they say they like this and they were okay with it. So I think more people who are in the public space trying to hold elected office, standing up for the ideals and the beliefs that they feel are more correct. is one thing.
Thank
And I
you.
think constantly reminding yourself who you are accountable to. So if we're doing this work and we can easily be derailed by a philanthropy's like idea of what a program should look like or whatever, like where is our loyalty? Is our loyalty to our own like kind of like careers and trajectory like Greg is talking about, or is it to the people who are most impacted? And I think just always having that front of mind leads to kind of abolitionist thinking, because the people who are most impacted are not being brought to the table. They are not, people in power are not accountable to them right now.
Representative Ayanna Pressley said the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And I think our job is, as much as possible, to facilitate that, to get out of the way, to take the lead of these folks who aren't just proximate to community, who are in community, right? I think we should be unafraid to set high expectations. I think we should reject small thinking, and really give ourselves permission to imagine a world completely unrecognizable to this one. To me, that's what abolition is. It's an orientation to the world that says we can be better. And it's not necessarily a different world as in new. Sometimes it's re-indigenizing our thinking, right? Sometimes it's learning from our elders and our ancestors, because, you know, there was a world before this one, and oftentimes it was a kinder, gentler, more cohesive, more community-driven world. And I think giving ourselves the chance to listen to our elders and the spirit of our elders, and also imagine a new world, is the only way we get through this.
Thank you all so much. Thank you both for the conversation tonight, as well as for all the incredible work that you do in our community to make it safer every single day. And thank you so much for everyone who joined us. This has been incredible. You have one more opportunity for a community conversation on divest and defund campaigns in Oklahoma City this coming Wednesday. I just dropped the link for that. We would love to see you all there. And also catch the Norman conversation, which will be going onto social media soon. The recording of this will also be shared, and please feel free to share this wonderful conversation. And again, thank you all so much. Such a life-giving conversation. So thank you, and have a good night.